Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Client Build 20 Part 3. The name of this build is Event Horizon. In this part of the build log, I'm going to focus on the final assembly, building the water cooling loops, the custom wiring, installing lighting. So by the end of this video, the system will be very close to completion. The client has decided on a small upgrade from the Samsung SM951 to the Samsung 950 Pro. I know some of you were wondering why we didn't use the 950 Pro to begin with. Well, it's just because I initially offered the SM951 as an upgrade because it was something that I had in stock, but the 950 is a nice performance boost over the SM951 and also an improvement in aesthetics. I've also at last completed the custom paint for this build and the mods. I've completed the cover panel that fits over the X99 chipset heatsink, so I've done the custom paint on this component. And as I mentioned in the last video, I've done it in the same effect that I did on the radiators and the custom reservoir mounting plate, but I've used a lot more of the blue flake. Now at this point in the build, certainly most of the time has gone into the mods. You know, the final assembly installing components literally takes minutes. It's only a fraction of the time that goes into a build like this. But from this point onwards, most of the time will go into the custom wiring. That's not always the case, but because of the Aquero farb work, Aquabus pumps, and all of the fans, there's a lot more custom wiring to do for this build than there usually is. You can see I've now installed the little cover panel, and that means the mods are finally complete for the motherboard, and I'm really happy with the way they've turned out. I've also installed the Samsung 950, and you can see it is an improvement in aesthetics with the black PCB. And I've rotated the CPU water block, and this is something I'll often do in my builds to improve the tubing routing, which is mainly just for aesthetics, because you can see, because I did this, I now have two tubes which are parallel and diagonal, and if I hadn't have done this, you know, the loop in this area would have looked terrible. I've installed the motherboard tray into the case for the final time. I've also installed the graphics cards and the pump and reservoir configurations, and I've completed the tubing up on the motherboard area. The tubing I'm using right through for both water cooling loops is Bitspower 16mm acrylic. I'll often drop back to 12mm acrylic in my builds for two different reasons. First of all, if I have to, if it becomes too cramped and 16mm doesn't fit. And the only reason I'm able to get away with using 16mm right through this build is because I haven't installed any motherboard water blocks. If you can imagine 2 extra water blocks on this motherboard area, it does become very cramped. And sometimes you can still just get away with using 16mm tube, but you have to put so much pressure on the components to fit it into position, and it ends up looking far too cramped anyway. And that brings me to my second reason for aesthetics if it looks too cramped, and that's often the case in an ITX system, for example. Now, as always, I'm using Bitspower Black Sparkle fittings, and I thought I'd just briefly mention why I always use these fittings. Well, first of all, it's by request, but I also use them in my own builds. When I first started using Bitspower fittings, Black Sparkle was the fittings I went with, and that's because back then there wasn't a lot of different options from Bitspower, but also because, well, my logic back then, and it still is now, that it ties in the silver components and the black components. And in a computer, there's often a lot of black components. In a water-cooled system, there's often a lot of silver components. And you can see the fittings that are installed on the memory water blocks, for example, they just blend so nicely with the silver background. Whereas if they were black, in which case you'd expect them to blend even better compared to a shiny chrome fitting, they actually stand out a lot more. And in short, the main reason I always use Bitspower fittings is because of their massive range. And if you want to check out Bitspower's full range, a lot of people ask me, where do you get all of your Bitspower fittings from? Performance PCs. I'll put a link in the video description. Now, I was going to use the MSI SLI bridge, the one that matches up with the godlike motherboards, but it was taking too long to arrive, and I would have had to have done the same mods to it that I did to the motherboard. And you know, when you have to paint something so small on its own, a lot of time goes in, and I just really didn't have time to do all of that for this build. But I actually much prefer these EVGA SLI bridges anyway, and there's EVGA graphics cards in this build. I just think these SLR bridges look amazing with the anodized billet alloy, the lighting. They're certainly my favorite SLR bridge at this point. I'm now preparing the Aquero 6 for installation and the FARB work, and I've installed the optional extra heatsink on the back of the Aquero 6. And the main reason I install this, I mean, extra cooling is always good, but it's mainly to improve the aesthetics because it covers up the PCB and it really cleans things up nicely. It's not really going to be visible, but it still is slightly visible, so you know, it's something that I always add. And something else I'm actually going to be adding to the Aquero 6, instead of the brushed stainless steel silver front plate, is a black front plate because I think it's going to match up with the front panel a whole lot better. Now, I haven't yet figured out where I'm going to mount the FARB work yet, because if you mount it properly, you need to drill 4 holes. But you know, in a case like this, the TH10A, there's plenty of positions, so I'm sure I'll figure something out. But it's certainly something I should have thought about at this point. But I'm thinking I'll probably mount it on one of the cover panels in the rear compartment. Now, I just wanted to briefly cover how these LED strips work with the particular cables that I went for it. The connector actually clamps onto the LED strip and makes contact with the contact points on it, and it clamps on very tightly. Now, at first I thought that it may just clamp directly on and pierce the rubber on the top of the LED strip, but it doesn't. You actually have to cut that rubber off, which is what you can see I'm doing. You have to be very careful. So you need to part it from the LED strip PCB itself and then cut it from the other side, and then you're easily able to clamp the connector onto the contacts. I'm installing 3 temperature sensors into this build, one for each water cooling loop, the coolant temperatures, and one for ambient, which you can see here, a tiny little temperature sensor plugged into the back of the Aquero right up in the top corner. So I've now installed the Aquero 6, and it's actually a few days later. I've done a lot of work on preparing the cover panels, of which there's 4 for this case, front, top, and the side panels. And that's something I talked about in the first part of this build log, how I buff the outer panels for my custom paint jobs, also the panels in the 5.25-inch bays. A lot of work cutting it flat and polishing it to a mirror finish. And I'm really happy with the way it's turning out. Now, no doubt some of you have noticed the differences in the color of the paint job. Well, that's because this is actually a 2-tone paint job, and I haven't even mentioned this until now. Well, the reason I did this is just as another little detail for this build, and also because I found 2 effects and colors that I really loved. They're both pearls. They're both semi-transparent because of the way that I've laid them on over the black, but one is lighter, one is darker. And the one on the outside, the outer panels, is darker and it has more of a sparkle to it, whereas the one on the inside is lighter and more subtle. So the camera doesn't actually really pick them up because they're pearls. The way they reflect the light is weird. It depends on the light and angle. So the camera doesn't really pick up the difference between them very well, or the effect at all. Now, I had to move the fan splitters from around the back of the radiators between the center panel of the case and the radiators to the ends. And I only had to do this on the 2 radiators in the rear compartment because there is less space in the rear compartment than the front compartment. You can see that I mounted the FARB work where I said I was going to, onto one of the cover panels, and that worked out really well. I'm really happy with it in this location. And this is something I do in all of my builds now. Instead of having all of these tiny little connectors for the power and reset buttons, which is hard to sleeve for, it's just messy, I replace it with a single USB 2 header. And as you can see, it's a lot cleaner. And I just left one of the connectors here so that you can see how I do it. But it's just a matter of getting the correct pin out. Other than that, it's a very easy little mod and definitely worth doing. At this point, I was planning on building both of the water cooling loops and filling them, but I've decided to prioritize the custom wiring because there's so much of it to be done in this build. I want as much access as I can get. Now this custom wiring has been done by IceMods, the 24-pin, 8-pin EPS, 4-pin ATX and PCIe, the cables for the core components. And I've been having the cables for the core components done by, well, somebody that I had employed locally. I've done a few different things with it, and the reason I've outsourced it for a long time now is just purely for efficiency, so that I can speed up my builds. You know, I delegate whatever I can, and there's some people out there that do incredible work with custom wiring. And as you can see here, IceMods has done an amazing job. So this is MDPCX sleeving, and you can see it's all black except for a couple of blue streaks on each cable, and the blue matches up really nicely with the custom paint job. It's heat shrinkless, which I much prefer. I absolutely love, because I know that it's a lot stronger and more durable, and I also prefer it for the aesthetics. But some of the first things that I look for to see, you know, how high quality the custom cables are is, most importantly, are all the cables the same length, the wires? Has the sleeving been pulled tight enough? Are there any dags or burning around the ends? You know, things like that. Are all the pins at the same level inside of the connectors? But I actually did a custom wiring guide recently. I'll put a link on the screen, and from that you can learn how to do all of this yourself. And not just the custom wiring for the core components, I also go through all of the different peripheral cables and wiring for just about everything in a high-end water-cooled system. So this is a cable that I built for the hard drives and SSDs that are going into this build. I'm not actually installing them myself. The client will be installing them when he receives the system. And these are the SATA data cables that I've prepared. So, you know, what I do is I outsource the cables for the core components, and then I do the rest of the cables. And in a build like this, it's roughly half and half. And, you know, from that you can see how much of a big job the custom cables for the core components actually are. Very time consuming. A lot of time goes into, you know, even just the 24-pin cable, but certainly worth it in the end. So I've now installed the custom wiring for the core components, and as you can see, it looks amazing. I'm really happy with it. The included cable combs just look amazing, and because it's been done so well, I haven't even managed any of this yet. So this is just sat in position. I've just plugged it in. Nothing else has been done, and this is just how it sits on its own. And that's what you get with high quality cables. They hardly need any training at all. So when it comes to cable management, there's so much less work to be done, and you know, they just look so much better. But you can see I've also been working on some of the other cables, and I've started connecting up to the back of the Aquero 6. So I've run cables from the 4 fan splitters to the 4 PWM fan channels on the Aquero 6, and it's good that each radiator is separate. This is something I always do with the Aquero, so that you can set up separate fan curves based on different temperatures, but this is something you'll see later. I've now completed the custom wiring, but I haven't yet done any of the cable management, and I'm actually going to leave the cable management as the very last thing to do in this build. And the reason for that is there's a lot of testing that I want to do for the Aquero 6, the FUB work, the fans, the Aquabus pumps, because it only takes one cable being, you know, partially unplugged. For example, you plug everything in, you start working somewhere else and accidentally pull on a cable, something like that, just something minor, and you're going to have problems. And if you've done all of the cable management and tied everything into position, sometimes it means going back and undoing a lot of the work that you've done to fix the little problem, whatever it may be. So I want to have the system booted and properly up and running to test everything to do with the Aquero 6 before I do any of the cable management. So that means that I need to build the water cooling loops before I can do that. So that's what I'm moving on to now. I'm going to continue building the loops. Now you can see I'm actually going to run fittings from one radiator to the other at the top and bottom of the build, because the top 2 radiators are for the CPU loop and the bottom 2 radiators are for the graphics cards loop. And this is, as I've mentioned, a tubing routing and component order that I've done previously in the TH10, and I'm also using the same or similar technique to what I've done previously in the TH10, running solid fittings from one radiator to the other because it's just the best way to do things, and you'll see exactly which fittings I'm going to use later in the build log. But I've now completed tubing up on this side of the build, and for this build I knew from the beginning that I was going to be bending the acrylic tube for sure instead of using fittings for the bends, and which way I go with that is always by client request, but certainly for this build I recommended bending acrylic tube because I have actually come to prefer it, although it does depend on the build. But for this build it was important because of the theme, Event Horizon. I wanted, you know, for example, the blue flake, the sparkles to shine through the bends, and then for the light to refract and, you know, reflect out in different directions to get that kind of warping effect. And you get this interesting effect on the bends of the acrylic tube if you do it really well, with the coolant flowing through it and light shining from behind it. It kind of looks like the light is warping. It just really fits the theme. I'm ready to fill the loops, and you can see I've already started filling the CPU loop, and I've already cycled the pump for the first time, but then I realized there was something that I'd forgotten to do around the back of the build, and you'll see that later on in the build log. It's a small mod for reinforcing the CPU loop, and I had to have the loop empty to do that. So I actually had to empty part of the loop back out again to do that little mod. Now I've put a little bit of coolant in the graphics card loop because I didn't know which cable was which for the pumps. Now usually I mark them, but I didn't do that this time. I can't trace the cables back to the pumps because of the way they're threaded through in behind the custom reservoir mounting plate. And you definitely don't want to run one of these pumps dry. It's not good for it. So a little bit of coolant in there. It doesn't matter if the pump runs for a couple of seconds, just in case. So I have the usual precautions in place. For those of you who are new to water cooling, the paper towels are purely a precaution. I don't expect to get a leak. The last time I got a leak, it actually came from the bottom of a reservoir. Wherever you have an acrylic to acrylic thread, you actually need to often tighten it a lot more than you would if it was, say, a metal to acrylic thread or metal to metal. And that's because the threads often grip to each other. They feel like they're tight, but they're not. So it can catch you out very easily. And you know, if you get coolant, for example, dripping down through the fan blades and into the radiator, it means I need to remove the fans, the radiators, a massive amount of time, which can easily be saved by taking the precaution of just putting down some paper towels. The other big precaution is the drainage system hooked up. That's obviously the quickest way to stop a leak. So I've started filling the CPU loop, and I'm using Mayhem's X1 clear coolant, which I'm going to dye. And you'd think for a build like this with this color scheme there wouldn't be many coolant options, but you know, there was so many to choose from. I could have gone with Mayhem's pastel black and clear, or pastel black and blue, black and clear UV blue, or black and clear blue and clear UV blue, or blue and clear. The list goes on. There really are a lot of choices. And what I really wanted to do to the coolant was add some Mayhem's Aurora Booster, the silver. But that is only designed for show systems. It doesn't last in a loop for very long. So, I mean, it would look amazing because of the kind of sparkling effect. It would go really well with the theme and match up. So each loop took about, well, nearly 2 liters, probably a bit over 1.5 liters per loop. And for the CPU loop, I had to cycle the pump 3 times before it was full. For the graphics card loop, only once, because the coolant drained down into the radiators below. I've decided on the coolant colors, and I'm now adding some Mayhem's blue dye to the CPU loop. Watch this.
Okay. Wow. Wow. No.
Jack, stand to the side a bit.
Wow. No.
That's Jake, my 2-year-old son, and you can tell he's impressed, and what he's going to be doing when he grows up He loves water cooling and he tries to help as much as he can, although I don't actually let him, not until he gets a little bit older. But these are the colors that I've chosen for the loops. So Mayhem's blue for the CPU loop and just clear for the graphics loop. And I think this is going to be best in combination with the RGB lighting, which, I'm certainly going to be setting to blue, but it may be changed. I mean, it would look good as maybe even white, purple. There'd be a few different options with the RGB lighting that would suit this build, but I think these coolant colors are going to suit best. I didn't really want to use pastel in this build. So that's it for this part of the build log. Both loops are full. All of the custom wiring is done. I've actually also installed the lighting at this point. So there's an LED strip at the top and bottom of the build, which in combination with all of the lighting on the motherboard is definitely going to be enough. So now all that needs to be done is the final cable management, and there is a lot of testing to do at this point, and I may end up changing a bit of the configuration around with the Aquero 6, and of course all of the testing. So that will be in the final part of the build log. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and favorite if you want to see more.